Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we're in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Innu, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation and Treaty 3 territory. My name is Neil Harden. I'm chairing today's panel. With me are Gail Anderson and Diane Knight. The assessor today is Jeremy Pohl, and the administrative personnel is Fran Picotto. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment rule in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the board. The board is appointed annually by council and is independent of it in the city administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order to be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value reclassification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the applications of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We'll then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions the applicant may have, then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all the evidence about an application to be brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You'll receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We will be hearing item 2 on our docket today. Ms. Picotto, please affirm the assessor's and applicant's testimony.
Mr. Assessor, please state your full name.
Jeremy Ryan.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to present at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Mr. Applicant, please state your full name.
Slaughter.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Okay, so gentlemen, the item on today's agenda is 444 St. Mary Avenue. Mr. Pohl, you can begin.
Okay. Roll number is 1209370200, 444 St. Mary's. The assessed value for 2029 is 49,520,000. I do have a recommendation that we'll get to. It is for 48,552,000, and that's based on an adjustment to the non-recoverable expense ratio. I'll get to that as a moment as we go along. But I'll get into the building now. The building was built in 1976. We have an effective year, effective year built, or effective age of 1997. Leasable area is 247,672 square feet. There is ample parking indoor, 168 stalls, and outdoor at 353 stalls. Go to page 2. There was a sale on this property in 2016. I'll touch base on that in a little bit. In 16, there was an 80% interest sale that occurred, and that was for 37,320,000. Extrapolated for the remaining 20% yields interest, for 100% interest of the sale would have been 44,784,000. So on page 3 is the description of the subject property straight from Morguard's website. Executive high-rise class tower, class it as a B prime. It's been under review with us. Both of us have been this before. We'll get to that in a moment. But it is a very prominent building in the downtown. So we look towards my page. There's just some more photos of the subject property to get its location. It's on Kennedy, bound by Kennedy, St. Mary's and Vaughan. It's connected to 400 St. Mary's, and there's a small walkway which leads to the Bay Parkade. Obviously, Bay's closed, but in theory, when it used to be open, you could walk around and get into the other skywalk. But it is open there to get from 444 St. Mary's to the Bay. But obviously, with it been shut down, it's not in use anymore. Page 12 just goes over the elevations of the property and some interior photos of the property leading onwards. Just to get a feel for it, it is good quality space. So, page 22, we have some listings for the property. We have get a feel for it as well. It's rated full of silver, and we have page 24 asking ranges between $16 and $18 to get into the building. So if we go to page 27, we'll just touch in base with the order that we have. Well, myself and Altus was involved with a very large appeal at the Municipal Board for 2020 year. This went into how we present our study, non-recoverables, and obviously the difference of opinion and value from Altus and us was decided upon by the board. We'll go through the order quickly just to get a feel for it. It's there for you in full for review if you choose. On page 29, some of the disputed issues, obviously the big one that can kind of overlap other orders was the calculation of non-recoverable expenses. To a minor point, there was also vacancy as well. The building at that point was experiencing under market vacancy with a pending large vacancy of anchor tenant left. So as we go through the order on page 31, highlighted, and this is highlighted for your convenience, just indicates what we were asking for as a board, how we calculated the non-recoverables. We used above line items. We didn't use, and we've been saying this for other than I've been doing this, we don't use tenant inducements, we don't use free rent, we don't use leasing commissions, things of that nature to reduce market value. So when we're looking at that on an income stream, when we're looking at it on financial data that's coming to us, we remove that from the analysis. And that's what I did with this study as well. So after review, on page 32, we indicated that that a slight bump from what our position was at 2% to 4% would be appropriate. I reviewed the stabilized expenses, and it was actually 4.7%. So I looked at the market, I looked at what the subject property was doing. It's a parameter like any other, and I made an adjustment for that there. There was a difference of opinion from the agent. The result for that would have been on page 34 of the order. Main part is highlighted in blue, and I'll read it just so you can get the Coles notes of it. Upon a careful review of all the previous board decisions, it's apparent to this panel that the matter of dealing with leasing commissions and tenant inducements was made clear and reiterated in many decisions. The board panel understands the agent's point of view that those decisions are dated, may have been argued differently in some cases, and that those decisions were rendered without the presence of a wholesome information provided in the hearing that we had. The board also notes that excerpts from guides and handbooks from other jurisdictions, but finds that these are of limited value in the matters at hand given the jurisdiction, given the board's many decisions on this matter. This board remains consistent with its findings on this matter and chooses to use the same wordings found in many previous decisions. The board reiterates its long-standing position that tenant improvements, leasing commissions, leasing incentives are not expenses which can be used to reduce income for the purposes of calculating market value. So essentially, they didn't change their position. So from that point, we had for that cycle, we had a very large argument, and should it be 2 or 5 kind of thing. I looked at it from a whole and went, well, it's just a parameter. Once we get to the municipal board, we can do big site specific and marketplace analysis, and I made an adjustment to 4% where I felt was okay. The board went up from there. The board found that 4.6 was more appropriate. The subject property it was an older building. It was dealing with, I believe at the time, issues with the parquet where they're actually putting a little more into that. There was some higher vacancy that was most likely was to be coming. So they had an elevated amount of non-recoverable expenses. From that, I do take a little bit of weight from what the board said. I reviewed the next couple of years as well, in this study that I'll present in a moment. And it did, and is continuing that this property has been experiencing a somewhat degree higher than market on non-recoverable expenses. So I have made an allowance for that, which I indicated the reduction was for. So on the next page, take a note that the board awarded a $3,315,915 NOI, and that's with the net operating for the building at $2,559,000 and the parking at $716,000. So getting back to the active constraint that will apply is on page 6, starting on page 6. I'll just wait for you to catch up. So page 6 and leading to page 7, we have 247,670 square feet. Our average rate that we applied was $15.53, which gives us a PGI of $3,847,343. 12% vacancy. I'll touch on that in a moment. I go through the actual study. Produces an effective gross income of $3,385,662. Expenses were at 3%. I have changed them to 5 in light of the board order and what I'm about to go through as well. So that gives us an expense of at 5%, $169,283. Shortfall remains the same, $14, which is $416,086. That produces a new net operating income of $2,800,293. So again, $2,800,293. Capped at 7% gives us a rounded number of $40,004,000. So there's a bit of adjustment there. My understanding is there is no issues with the parking. I'll go through it quickly. The parking we have on page 8, 353 stalls for outdoors parking at $92 a stall, and then heated parking at 168 stalls at $103.50 a stall, which gives a net operating income of $590,368, capped at 7%. It is an estimated value of $8,540,000. So on the next page is a summary of both income streams, with again the adjustment to the non-recoverables that I just made at $40,004,000 gives us our recommended value of $48,553,000. So if we turn to the market study, starting on page 1, and I apologize, usually I have a write-up with it. The write-up wasn't complete. It is now, and it'll be used going forward, but I will explain. Everything is here anyway, so I will explain. Starting on page 2, we did a full review of the marketplace. I've done a full marketplace study. It's 8 years shown here. I reviewed every single OFB building that leased up on a net rent basis. And from that, we have all the parameters reviewed, and then a global marketplace of Winnipeg, what the Winnipeg market is. And then we have cross-reference against the Johnson report, what they're asking. And then we get into the individual properties as we go along. So just so we go through, in 2022, we see that the weighted average for the Winnipeg marketplace was $15.46. Vacancy, it's considerably increasing over the last few years. It's started from really around 13% in 2019, leading up to 24% in 2022. And then we have our weighted shortfall at $15.85 and a non-recoverable weighted average at 2%. When we're at in this board, I do stabilize. I usually stabilize the last 3 years. Look at 5, we stabilize the last 3 years. I've done that for the study as well to give a better metric of performance in the property. So stabilized values are highlighted on the last column, and that's from the years of 2020 to 2023, and that's why the line goes down, and it goes all the way down through all the comparables as well. So what we have here is a weighted average of $14.93 for rent, a vacancy of 18.8%. Historical weighted average of $14.84 and a non-recoverable weighted average of 2.2%. And that is for 216 CRUs that have either leased up in those years or that were step-ups in those years, which changed rent. So this is a reflection of what's in place in the marketplace and what these properties are generating at that moment in time. So it's not just, let's look at it from a few comparables, let's look at it from a small moment in time. This is a large review, and essentially at this board, I'm doing exactly what I would do with the municipal board. I'm presenting a stabilized value of the market, and it's quite in depth. So what we covered was 216 CRUs, which is approximately 1.2 million square feet of stabilized leasable area. So that is the marketplace. I think it's the most comprehensive look at the marketplace that you're going to see, and the most accurate reflection of what that is. So moving on, we also cross-reference it against outside sources. Outside sources is on the bottom of page 2. There really is only 2 that I can use. Is the Johnson report and Cushman Wakefield. They're the ones that consistently report every year. There's some variance within other bodies that report. So that data is not always available, but these are the 2 that release quarterly, or Cushman Wakefield releases quarterly, and the Johnson report releases semi-annually. So these are the 2 that we're going with. So for 2022, we can see that the weighted average is $16.01. The vacancy for Cushman Wakefield is 15.8%. Then the stabilized values is as such 16.4 and 14.2. Just so we're clear, the 14.2, all of the vacancy for Cushman Wakefield is a little bit lower because I believe they include owner occupied properties in that, so it does drop it a little bit. I can't separate that out because they don't report in such a way that the Johnson report does with an inventory that you can actually go through and do a bit of analysis on. So moving on to the Johnson report, we see that the weighted average is $15.63 a square foot for 2022, in combination with a vacancy of approximately 21%, 21.2% for weighted average. And you can see the difference between the last line of the vacancy unadjusted for, which is at 16%. So they give a building inventory on their report. We can go through the inventory and we can actually do all the analysis on it. It's nice. They don't need a report that I know that does that. So shortfall for the weighted average, what they're asking for CAM and tax is at $50.88. So, and then $15.38 for the stabilized. So if you have a good metric there, vacancy is a bit, it's pretty much in line. We don't really see what we see in the last little bit, where there was some space being withheld. They're not advertising it. Obviously, in some buildings, in some circumstances, there were spaces that were already had commitments to, so you're not going to advertise that. You're just waiting for a physical occupancy of that. Here, you don't see so much of that, but we have reported from the Johnson report at 18.1%. Stabilized. We have the weighted average for my own calculations at 18.8%. It's pretty much what you see. So moving on to page 9 in the report.
Which page? Sorry.
9.
Thank you. Thank you.
Should catch up.
Yeah.
2015, and this is the subject property that we'll be looking at. It'll be the last 444 St. Mary's, which is the last property in each, just above the line. What we see is they had 8.5% vacancy in 2015. They're asking $13, and of course they have their shortfall there as well. In 2016, they had 8.1%, $13. On the next page, 2017, they had 2.5%. And that was $14. And then in 2018, they had 2.2%, $14 as well. 2019, they had 5.6% vacancy, asking $15. It went up $1 from 13 to 14 and then 14 to 15. And then in 2021, they had 5.2%, asking $15. And then in 2022, 64%, asking $15.50. The main thing happened here, and I'll get to that as we go through the NOIs, I'll review that as well, is Great West Life, or then Great West Life, now Canada Life, left their building and they moved back to their headquarters at $6,100 more. This was discussed at the municipal board. There was a large vacancy potentially. I think everyone knew the Great West Life was going to be leaving as their headquarter office, their OBA office was complete, and they were moving their tenancies back to that. So in this report, there was an elevated reporting of the NOI because they were basically at 2% vacancy. They're under market, so their NOI is going to be higher. I recommended market at 9% for vacancy. I think Mr. Slaughter recommended 6.5. They went with the market, so they thought that was the best reflection. So that's one of the parameters that they did use. That was knowing full well that you had a very large tenancy, an anchor tenant that occupied 65% of your well, not quite at 65%, it was about 60% of the building, which had very little potential to leave the building. So with that, they still awarded the vacancy at market. So from that, feel that our rent, go back to page 7, that $15.53, which is basically at market. You see that in the study, it's $15. You see they're asking for $15.50. Bottle is $15.50. I think that's a very reasonable number. So getting to the NOIs, I'll just review the NOIs quickly. That will be on page right, the last 3 pages of my brief. I apologize, I had it must have gone.
Pardon me, which page number?
The last 3 pages of the brief. I don't know what the image would be. It says page 17 on page. It says page 18 actually, but that can't be page 18. It's just well, my headers must have been out of place. So it's the last. It's the third last page of the brief.
Which brief are you talking about?
Assessors. Brief.
Your main brief or the
main brief, not the study.
okay.
So your main
So-
brief is 55 pages long, so page like 52.
The third last page.
Okay.
It's mislabeled at page 18, which can't be.
Which says 444 St. Mary's 3-year
Yes.
budget comparison?
Yes, 2023.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just so we're clear, this is 2022. More I've looked through there. It always seems like they're a little bit ahead when they're not. But this is how they report this. The time they reported this didn't exist in 2020 when they reported it. Just whatever reason, their internal way of they do this reports that. But this is for 2022, and you do see that highlighted. So what we see, the impact of the vacancy, net operating income. See a drop in at 3 million, a little over 3 million, and then you see just over 2 million for the 2022. So you have a scenario where you have a good, deep grind. Had under market vacancy for a number of years. You had an anchor tenant occupying a significant amount of space in the building. And when an anchor tenant decides to leave, it leaves a big hole. That was contemplated, and this award, still awarded market rent. I'll get into some rebuttals well later, to prove my point on what vacancy this board should award. But I do want to point out that net operating income has been dropped, and that is significant from what we're putting in. But we also see on page 3 what the vacancy was when they were, again, under market vacancy. They were about 2%, 5%, and around there. They're pushing an NOI of about 4 million. So it is a substantial drop, but we see what this building can generate. So from that, I do feel that our NOI that we have in place is reflective of market, not necessarily site specific when they were performing a Superior's market or after the vacancy occurred, which obviously would take down a drop in that. So I do feel that the recommended value 48,552,000 is reasonable and should be awarded today. And with that, I'm open to questions.
Okay, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paul, just start off on page 1 of your brief, something that caught my eye. The actual year built of the property is 1976. Historically, I believe the effective year was around 1976. Now it's 1997. What happened to change the effective age?
I didn't change the effective age, it'd just be the numerous permits that were taken out over the years. I didn't get into that as far as verifying the effective age sections in the model on behalf.
Could it be an error? Because I've never seen an age jump that drastically when the building hasn't really had significant improvements.
That's what we have. I did do that for the scope of this.
Okay, that wasn't you, you're saying.
No.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start with your commentary around the net operating income. So if we could go back to the pages you described, it was the third last page in your brief. And we're looking at the actual 2021 NOI. And I'll say this cautiously. I've said every time we are examining a property in a fee simple fashion, that we need to be cautious when we're looking at the actual leased fee NOI. It is not the same valuation that we're trying to perform.
No, correct.
But what you did show is that in 2021, where we had the large tenant, Canada Life, who occupied 126,000, about half of the building. And the property at that time with Canada Life completely in place was 3 million, correct?
I believe the year before was 4 million, but yeah.
Yeah, so let's think about that. Year before, the same Canada Life still in place. The NOI dropped from 4 million to 3 million without Canada Life even leaving. So you would glean from that the property was showing weaknesses in its performance, notwithstanding the vacancy of Canada Life.
Vacancy is not a point in time, it's an over calendar year. Vacancy may show up depending on how you're looking at it, and may artificially look more if you look at the NOI depending on how the vacancy erodes. So we just get the year-end result. If you do it from a month by month, you get the better analysis, but I can't just year by year that we get.
Okay, but you brought our attention to this, so I just want to make sure that we understand what we're looking at. Because then as we move into 2022 budget, you admit that the NOI drops yet again $1 million, and yet Canada Life is still in occupancy for just about 2/3 of that year.
I'm showing you what the vacancy was. I'm showing you what they reported in NOI at around 4 million down to just over 2 million with that vacancy drop of their major tenant leaving.
Okay, so we're on page 18 right now of your appendix. If we go back to page 6 of your appendix, please. This will actually be the income statement relative to the, or most relevant to the reference date. It's the 2022 year-end statement. And here we see that their budget was pretty spot on for 22. They ended up just over 2 million. But then for 2023 budget, you agree that the NOI is 352,000. And that is actually post Canada Life vacated.
It's highlighted next to it, yes.
Yeah, but we didn't talk about that. That's what actually was on the precipice of what's next for the performance of this property.
If that's how you're choosing to look at it.
Okay, thank you. So a lot of what we just described there, and the drastic decline in the net operating income of the property is, as you mentioned, predominantly because of the vacancy. So let's talk about vacancy a little bit. You had said that the city applies a market vacancy allowance for Class B of 12%. And that's the standard market allowance applied to most Class B, is that correct?
Right.
Right. And certainly you're not saying that site-specific performance isn't recognized, because we have seen cases of some elevation to that allowance for certain properties.
Right.
Correct? Okay. But we're not seeing any sort of escalation for the subject property. Okay. You had said as much, but it's in your evidence as well in the listing that if you look at the amount of space vacant at the reference date, it's 160,000 square feet, which is 65% of the building. Yes. And so again, that is not being considered at all in the market vacancy allowance.
No, I can give further explanation if you like, or.
Sure.
Basically, when you're looking at it, you see a building that has under market vacancy, it's capable of being that, yet an anchor tenant lead. When that happens, it leaves a big hole if your anchor tenant occupies more than half the building, obviously. I don't see any barrier to occupancy here. There's no functionality that's preventing that. By definition, they were fully occupied. What you see is a rent that's escalating every year. Well, basically every year you see go from $13 up to $15.50. They're not keeping it at
Those are
13.
asking to be.
Those are asking, but you don't see them asking rate dropping to try and mitigate it the way some other properties have. 250 Gary is an example. What they have is a very good building that an anchor tenant just left and it's just starting. We don't see that vacancy hovering at an elevated market vacancy for a number of years. So to put a adjustment for vacancy for, I think it's less than a calendar year, it would be, in my opinion, unwarranted at this point.
Okay, so I think what you're basically saying is that the 65% vacancy is just a blip, nothing to worry about, and we'll be back at market in no time flat. It's basically what.
It's, look at it from a different perspective. It's the same reason why the board did an award for the 2020 PL $4 million NOI, because they had an under market vacancy. They put market vacancy in place.
I
So
think
we're looking at it from the same perspective. I'm looking at it from the same perspective. Do you expect this building to go back to market vacancy? Will it take a couple of years? Sure, probably, unless you have an anchor tenant that can absorb that much. Doubtful in this market at this moment in time, but I do believe this is a higher performing property and it will get back down to market vacancy.
Okay, just to be clear on your statement about the municipal board, the delta between what Altus was suggesting as actual vacancy stabilized at 6.5% and market vacancy at 9% was very small. The delta between your market vacancy and actual vacancy here is very large.
No, but what I'm saying is when you take the NOI, which was in place with about a 1% and 1.8% was that's about a $4 million what they projected to. So that is a big difference in the NOI. It's about 24%.
Okay, so if I could turn your attention, please, to your study, the comprehensive study on the marketplace. So what you're basically saying is that we're ignoring the fact that the property is decimated from an occupancy standpoint and that it should flash back to market in no time flat. So let's talk about the market of downtown office in Winnipeg at the reference date. So at the top of page 6, top right, you have the
Page 6.
sorry, no, page 2 of your study. At the very top right, we're looking at the conclusions of the vacancies.
Which page are you looking at? It's
This is page 2, Mr. Chairman, of the market rent study.
oh,
or the-
page 2. Okay. All right.
Second page in. And so if we
Right.
go to the top of page 2, the first 5 rows refer to rents and the next 3 refer to the vacancy conclusions.
Right.
And if we look at the bolded column or row, it says vacancy weighted average, and we go across to the reference date 22. The market vacancy for Class B in 2022 is 24%. Is that correct?
Yes, I stated that.
Okay, and the regular average, not weighted, is 22.9.
Right.
So I guess my question, Mr. Pohl, is if we're ignoring the site-specific massive vacancy in the subject property, instead saying it will revert to market. Market's 24%. How do we get 12?
Well, first of all, I looked at it from a stabilized perspective, market's at 18.8% or 17.9% or a median 14.4%. So I'm not just looking at the 1 year scary, I'm looking at 3 years stabilized, but I'm also looking at 8 years total. And what we can see for the subject property, we see a better than market average performance and vacancy. And then you see, obviously the large increase with our anchor tenant leaving. This
Okay,
market, this building would go back into the market and compete against other properties that aren't as desirable as it should be able to perform well in the marketplace.
That's your opinion, correct?
It is my opinion.
Okay. So let's talk about that then. You're saying that, okay, don't worry about, number one, actual vacancy in the subject. Don't worry about the market, which is double the vacancy of what we're applying. Let's look rather to the stabilized vacancy because, in your opinion, things aren't getting, more concerning. It's just a blip in 22.
No.
But let's be clear, the stabilized vacancies are 18%.
Right.
Right, and that still is significantly higher than the 12% applied.
The study is a reflection of the marketplace in the totality and every individual property that's being netted out on a net, or at least done on a net basis. It's an accurate reflection. What I'm saying is, given this moment in time, do you think there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction to every property owner is going to sell their property on a fire sale, or are they going to look at it overall? How is your building performing? How's your building performing within the marketplace? What's the history of your property and what it is at this moment in time? I don't see any need to make adjustments for a building that is literally outperforming the marketplace. This is the one building that you shouldn't be making an adjustment for. Just because you have an anchor tenant leave doesn't mean we value how that building operating strategies for that property owner is occupying that building. You're valuing the physical real estate. We see the physical real estate being able to outperform the actual marketplace. So if we're valuing it on an operating standpoint, well, we're not. We're doing it on a fee simple standpoint. And what we see is there is an elevated moment of obviously vacancy coming up, including the Class A's. We're not talking A's today, but in combined with the Class A's. And we do see that. But I think a 12% vacancy is reasonable for this property because I think it will outperform the marketplace just the same way it did before. So it's just a matter of this bubble of time. It has to be absorbed and it'll be it'll normalize once given enough time. I just don't think you can make that call right now. If I seen this building for 4 or 5 years and it's hovering around a greater than market or greater than, then we can have that conversation whether it needs to be an adjustment made.
Okay, so just taking away all opinion then, just a very simple question. You do agree that your own study indicates that both the 2022 and the stabilized 3-year vacancy in the market for Class B downtown office is significantly higher than the market vacancy that you've applied to the subject?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Cap rate, 7.7%. And I think in your evidence, the only cap rate discussion was on page 10.
Other than the cap rate that they ordered in this report, yeah, one page.
Okay. And again, the municipal board, that was an April 18 valuation at a time when the vacancy, as we discussed, was very low because they had that tenant who just re-signed Canada Life occupying over 50%. Yeah. The Class B vacancy on page 10, according to the brokers, Colliers is a low, but we have a correction, so I'll put that one aside for a moment. The other brokers are saying anywhere between 7 to 8.5%, so 7 being the floor from the other two brokers. And you've mentioned before that this, in your opinion, is a B prime. And that's why you're saying that, performance aside and everything else, this is as good as it gets. So this would be at the floor for cap rate for Class B.
It is a B prime. It's one of the best in the cities.
Okay, can you explain that? What makes this a B prime? What makes it one of the best Bs in the city?
Their asking rates are between $16 and $18.
Are they attaining that?
Finish, they're asking between $16 and $18 in a moment in time where there is a high degree of vacancy. You don't see the property owners dropping their ask to get in. What you see is a very healthy NOI, even in combination with Canada Life. You can argue that was a lower rent than it should have been, but even with that, you can see the NOI is literally at $4 million. You see the under market vacancy for a number of years. I don't know how the physical building, how you can look at this building, the physical characteristics of this building and the occupancies that were in place, not come away that it's a good financial investment. So it is a B project.
So you mentioned, I think the one thing you mentioned there is that one time in the past it had a $4 million NOI, but do you have any evidence of how that compares to other Class B buildings? Is that good? Is that bad?
It's an executive. Morgan is claiming it's an executive class building.
In their marketing material, they call it an executive. The building was built in 1976, correct? And it's located basically at the periphery of the downtown, correct? And it's not connected to the continuous skywalk, correct? Okay.
And yet it still produced a very healthy NOI.
Once upon a time. That's all the questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Ms. Knight, any questions?
I just want to confirm numbers, if that's okay. The NOI is 2800293 for a total of 40,004,000.
00293 adjusted, yes.
Yes, and then 40,004,000.
40,004,000, yes, and then I don't believe there is no adjustments made to the parking.
Parking. So the total for the building is 48,552,000, correct?
Right, and that's based on sole adjustment taken away from what the municipal board said with the actual subject property. Oh, sorry, I should probably touch base on that. You look at 444 St. Mary's highlighted, or on the bottom of page 3, I don't believe it's highlighted, it's highlighted on mine. What we see is the vacancies. And what we see is the rents that are in place for the step ups, 23 stabilized, 30% stabilized over the 3 years, 20 to 22, which of course we've already discussed quite in depth at about 65% vacancy in the 2022 year. But if you look at the non-recoverables, consistently they're high. They just are. So when we're reviewing, we saw that at the municipal board for the 2020 appeal. When I looked at the 2020, 21, 23 years, we see 7, 5.7, 8.9 for stabilized at 7.1. I did the same rationale for the adjustment to put it to 5% that I did in this report. So they chose 4.6, so 3% of 4.6. So that's why I went to 5. Still elevated how they operate there.
All right, and I just want to confirm the expenses, 169,283
Yes.
at 5%. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Anderson, any questions?
I have no questions. They've been asked and answered. Thank you for your presentation.
All right, and I have no questions that haven't been asked and answered. So, Mr. Slaughter, you can begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask the panel please to turn to the predominant document for our valuation. We have 2 documents. One is cap rate study and the second is 444 St. Mary.
Do we have the cap rate study?
I hope so. It was submitted.
Yeah, it should be in your OneDrive.
Yes, it's their office capitalization rate.
Oh, I got it now. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Well, I'll come to that.
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure I had it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Mr. Pohl has gone through the property. I don't mean to spend much time on the property description in this case. On page 6, we do have an aerial photograph of where the property is located and a photograph of the building. And you can see that the property consists of really 2 parts. One is the 17-story tower. And beside that is what I'll call a podium, a 2-story podium, which connects to the above ground parkade, which extends back south from its St. Mary location. Both the parkade and the building were constructed in 1976. It is the largest of the Class B buildings. Actually, if I could ask you please to turn to page 3435 for one moment. I'll just back up and kind of take a look at the downtown Winnipeg Class B market as we talk about the subject. So I have listed here the most of what are considered the Class B towers in Winnipeg. And on page 35 is a map of where each is located. So the first thing I'd like to bring to your attention, and I'm sure you're all aware, but you know, when we talk about how we rank this building within the Class Bs, one of the most important factors, and certainly one of the most important factors in its marketability, is that it is really on the periphery of the downtown. You can see it marked with an S, in the bottom left of the map on page 35. Notwithstanding it's 386 Broadway, it's probably the furthest from the Portage and Main Center. It also, and this is the most important part, it is not connected to the continuous walkway systems and underground concourses. It is connected only to its sister property, 400 St. Mary, and then it's connected on the other side across to the Winnipeg Clinic. Previously, you were able
I believe it's not connected to the Winnipeg Clinic itself, but to the parkade. I
You're
don't think-
correct. Yeah, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair. Yeah, that's right. And from there, historically, you could walk on the exterior of the Bay Parkade, then through the bay, and you would end up on the north side of the walkway. But unfortunately, since 2020, that is now cut off. So the buildings are basically isolated from any sort of walkway system since 2020. Another very important factor when discussing with property management about the marketability of their property that is a concern. The third interesting note, it is actually the largest of all the Class B buildings. It was designed originally as an owner occupant or single occupant building. And they ended up going vacant. It went to the market. It had some difficulties and some successes marketing. It then had Centra Gas occupy the building in the late 2000s, who then also vacated when Manitoba Hydro Tower was complete. So it's had this history of being built or occupied by a larger tenant and then things changing as those tenants leave. The only other thing I'd mention about the construction being in 1976 is the parkade is in the 1970s, many of the parkades had concrete with post-tension construction, and this has been recognized as problematic 50 years later. We had a parkade on Smith Street as well that had the same circumstance. One of these cables actually snapped in that case and shot out and could have killed somebody. And they have this problem at 444 St. Mary. They just spent a considerable amount trying to band-aid the solution. And when I was at the property last week to walk through again, I learned that they have the situation upcoming again. So it's a problematic construction with capital repairs required. The other thing about the property is it has not undergone any significant improvement. One of the things happening in downtown Winnipeg office market in the last while is because of the fact there's numerous difficulties being faced by owners. So to try and keep above the increasing vacancy and declining incomes, they're in many cases investing into their buildings and trying to upgrade HVAC systems, become more energy efficient. We see this in a lot of the A's and many of the B's. Subject property is doing well, but certainly not keeping up in that way. It is not LEED certified. It has not had any major improvements to its mechanical or HVAC systems. What I would conclude by that property description, Mr. Chairman, is that I disagree with the assessor's comments. This is not a B prime, if I knew what a B prime was. To me, a B prime would be located on the walkways or concourses. It would be more centrally located. It would have had investment into the building recently to be more competitive. This is not a B prime. I would consider this a B minus. So we move on then to the most applicable value approach, which is the income approach. And on page 12, we start discussion about how to determine the market rent for a property in a fee simple analysis. And I'm actually going to make this very quick because our analysis of market rent is almost bang on. I think it's 10 cents higher per foot than the city. So Mr. Pohl has done a very diligent job. I know that he goes through the rents after the model. I will take a moment to note that Mr. Pohl and I have spent the better part of this month diligently going through all office towers under appeal to great success. And there's only a few instances where our opinions don't quite meet, and that's why we're here. But anyway, Mr. Pohl did a good job on the analysis of the market rents, and we are actually only about 10 cents higher. So I'm going to suggest that there's very little concern. I'll leave these couple thoughts because oftentimes when we're here, we talk about, well, what is it that we do when we do a fee simple analysis? Are we looking only at the contract rents? would be called a lease fee analysis. Do we ignore the contract with rents and look to market? Well, the answer is neither. The boards have directed us that in a market rent analysis for fee simple purposes, you start with the subject property. You examine what's happening to the property because, as was stated by the municipal board in a decision for the Richardson building, the use of rental rates from other buildings as opposed to rental rates the use of the rental rates in the building as opposed to rental rates in other office building overcomes the need to make adjustments for differences in location, age, amenities, etc. between the subject comparisons. What they're saying is that you can't ignore the site-specific realities of the subject. What you need to do is recognize that if there's abnormalities or exceptions within the actual rents, an obvious example is a non-market, non-arm's length rent, or anything else that doesn't hit your market and you don't have an explanation for why, then you have to test that to market. So you're looking at both. You're looking at site-specific, which allows you to say that, yes, this is a value of the subject property, not a hypothetical office building. But then you need to test that to market. I think that's the exercise that both Mr. Pohl and Altus had done. And I think we are at least on the same page with that because we came very close in our conclusions. So I'm going to jump ahead on all of the discussion on the nuances of factors that we must look at when we are considering the appropriate market rent. On page 14, we look to the asking rents according to the brokers for various types of properties in Winnipeg. And the Class Bs hover around the $15 to $16 a square foot. The subject property, as Mr. Pohl mentioned, is asking 16 to 18. I can tell you that they're not attaining 16 to 18. They're attaining the best rents that they have had, which will be coming up in a moment in the analysis. They're attaining 14 to 16. So, and this is common. There is typically a delta between what somebody asks for a rent, and especially in a market like we have today, which I'll describe as a soft market, what they can actually attain. So do not, I guess, when you look at asking, you need to test what's actually happening in the property. We go through recent rents in the Class B market. They are basically showing that the average rent is around $15. And as I mentioned, the subject properties, most recent leases on the 10th floor are at $14 and $16 a square foot. So we've applied market where necessary. We've looked at actual, if tested, to market, and we come to $15.63 a square foot for the market rent, which, as I mentioned, is only about 10 cents a square foot higher than the city. So we're very close. And what we have done there, just to reiterate, is be very careful to recognize site-specific performance in relation to market. That then brings us to the most contentious point, is vacancy allowance. The city has applied 12%. The city has mentioned that they do not look at site-specific in this case because, well, to simplify, I think, the comments, it will improve. I mean, 65% vacancy is just a blip. Well, then my point is, okay, if we are looking at market, let's look at market, because market's a lot higher than 12. Market, according to the brokers, ranges from 15 to 17% for Class B. And let's put this in context. That's a vacancy allowance that is continuously rising from 2018 through 2022. And why it is rising is a number of factors that are happening in the occupancy in downtown Winnipeg. Number one, and this starts pre-pandemic, we started to see an oversupply versus a static demand. There was no more, after what I'll call the renaissance of downtown Winnipeg until about 2017, we saw very little net new tenancies in downtown Winnipeg. What we saw is tenants moving buildings as vacancy increased. And that started a competition by landlords to invest in their buildings to attract tenants. And all of a sudden what you have is what we call a tenant's market, not a buyer's market. And that is a soft market for ownership. So that was number one. Number two, of course, is the pandemic. Now, the pandemic didn't really have an effect on office per se. Leases continued through, incomes were fine. It didn't have the effect it had on certain other properties at that time. But what the pandemic did is lead to a change in how people use offices, the hybrid work model. And I'll get into this a little bit further, but the hybrid work model, which I'll talk about in the cap rate study, has had an effect on downtown occupancy. We don't see it until the leases come on. And as the leases come up, as one would expect, and as we've been saying for the last couple of years, the vacancies start escalating. And what we have is that vacancy is actual physical vacancy in the marketplace. It does not consider what we call ghost vacancy. There's a number of premises that are leased, not part of our physical vacancy, that we know right now are empty. Tenants are not occupying those spaces, and they have no intent on renewing their lease, most likely. So if I'm an investor, and remember what the exercise here is, we're trying to determine the best stabilized year one vacancy from which we determine the rate of return the market would apply. So we're looking at the present, we're looking at the market. We look back only for context on what we think is going to happen next. And if we look at these factors, there's nothing in what I'm describing that makes you think what's ahead of you is rosier than what you have today. On top of that, back to the supply-demand comments I made. At this moment in time, in April 23, every investor in downtown Winnipeg who's looking at 15 to 17% market vacancy, arguably, and that includes owner-occupied space. Because as the city study shows, when you take out owner-occupied space, you're at 22 to 24% vacancy. So if we're looking at that, and we understand that there's ghost vacancies happening, we understand that the market is soft, and then we turn and we see that Wawanesa is constructing a 300,000 square foot building at the True North Square. And Wawanesa is occupying a great deal of the space that is constituting occupied space at this time. That only causes one to believe that the vacancy will increase further. So the comments being made about why we're not looking at site-specific vacancy, number one, I think are wrong. That we're ignoring the actual vacancy in the market is wrong. That we would look backwards rather than forwards is wrong. I think every one of the reasons that the assessor mentioned for using a 12% vacancy, in my opinion, is wrong. The performance of the property itself on page 17. In 2018, the property was at approximately 5%. That's what was contemplated at the time of the municipal board order that has been stated. And everybody knew, as the assessor said, that that was actually the anomaly. That's only because Canada Life was occupying half the building and had been for 10 years and signed on for a 5-year extension because they were renovating their head office. Now, to be clear, Altus did not once bring up the speculation that Great-West Life would not be continuing their occupancy when we were arguing at the municipal board. We argued for a 6% vacancy allowance. We did not once say the vacancy should be higher because Canada Life is leaving. And the reason we didn't do that is because even though we knew it, I knew that, I couldn't provide the board written evidence as of April 18 that that was the case. So not once in that decision did we bring up the pending vacancy. But of course, what the inevitable was happened. Vacancy actually started increasing significantly in the property regardless of Canada Life. We went up to a 15% vacancy at the end of 21. Recall at the questioning, I was asking the assessor about the drop in the NOI from 4 million to 3 million to 2 million. That had nothing to do with Canada Life. Canada Life only vacated in the last part of that last year. After they vacated, went to 300,000. And we see now in 22 at year end that with Canada Life vacating, we're at 65% vacancy. I mentioned historically, before Canada Life occupied the building, Centra Gas had been the major tenant. And when Centra Gas left, the same thing happened. It went 35% vacant. Luckily, around that time, Canada Life needed space. That was a very different market with very different circumstances. If I was an investor looking at this market, we are not, I would say that we will not get below 25% vacancy probably for the next 5 years. And even if we do, we will be very, very lucky. So how do we treat significant vacancy like this in evaluation? Well, I think the municipal boards have been very clear. Municipal Board Order A223553 is a fairly recent decision on an office industrial property at 75 Scurfield. The facts in that appeal were that the property had a basically a 3-year stage of stabilized vacancy over 3 years of 51%. It had actually been dropping by the reference date. It was at 37.8%. Okay. Now, subject property, conversely, has currently a 65% vacancy and a 3-year stabilized of 31%. Very, very similar numbers, just that our trajectory is getting worse and theirs was getting better. So I just want you to think about that for a moment while I describe what the board's conclusion was. The board's conclusion was, we will apply a 25% vacancy allowance, and they stated, the board will follow the precedent set by the board that the board cannot ignore actual vacancy rates in making evaluation of income. We should not ignore this. This is a site-specific factor which influences the value, which is the exercise by the legislation for us today. And this comes from clear guidance from other orders. I'm just including two in the brief here, but 325 Broadway was a very compelling precedent-setting decision back in 1999. And it stated, if a site-specific situation shows that a vacancy rate is clearly different from the normal rate, then the board is justified in using a vacancy rate that reflects the actual situation. So let's just put that in context too. Normal, again, is somewhere between high teens and low 20s. Actual is 65%. The city has applied 12. So we ask that the board consider not 25%, which is usually the highest vacancy allowed unless there is obsolescence factors that would warrant a higher increase. We ask the board to consider 20% as the vacancy allowance. The next item is a minor one, but shortfall. The actual expenses in CAM in 22 for the subject property are $17.31. So we've applied $16 a square foot as a shortfall, not 14. The non-recovered expenses. It's funny because this property was the subject of the non-recovered expense fight at the municipal board last summer that Mr. Pohl and I were involved in. Let me be clear about Altus's position on this. We were adamant that a higher non-recovered expense ratio, or sorry, not ratio, allowance was warranted for properties, and it was wrong for the city to have dropped it from 7 to 3%. The reason we were adamant, though, is not necessarily because of the actual expenses. It was because when you are valuing property by the direct capitalization approach, you need to be consistent in how your cap rates are derived and how you value the property. And it was our opinion that the city modelers did not change the rationale for their cap rates when they changed a major factor in the NOI, which was the non-recovered. So we were simply saying, be consistent. And if you're not being consistent, put it back to 7%. As part of that fight, when you get into the weeds of the fight, there's many items considered non-recovered. One was leasing commissions. The boards have said that they're not going to include leasing commissions in non-recovered. That's a fair statement. As an appraiser, I know that you can do either. You can either include it in your income or you can include it after your capitalized value. But let me be clear, very clear on one thing. The municipal board never said ignore leasing commissions or tenant improvements. They never said that. They said we will not include it in the income. And what that means is if you face leasing, if I'm an investor and I know that I have a vacancy and I'm going to have to cure that vacancy, and in order to cure the vacancy, I'm going to have to spend dollars both in tenant improvements and leasing commissions. There is absolutely no way that that's going to be ignored. So whether you include it in your income or you consider it in your cap rate, it will be considered. My point here, Mr. Chairman, is that we're not seeking the increased non-recovered expenses anymore, but what we have done is adjusted our cap rate studies so that 3% is now used, so that we are consistent in our methodology, and we are making sure that the capitalization rate we apply reflects that change. So we accept the 3% on the non-recovered expenses. We have added, the city has not done this, but we've added income for storage, $36,000. And then we come to the last point, which is the capitalization rate. So if I may ask the board, please, to turn to that second document.
Okay.
Capitalization rate study. A lot of information in here, and I know that all three of you have heard us go through a lot of this, so I'm going to hit the high points. I won't get too deep into it.
Which page, sorry?
We'll start on page 2, please. So we go through the definition of the cap rate. I know that I need not do that, but I'd like to point out one thing at the bottom of page 2, that there are myriad factors which are going to influence a capitalization rate. Now, I'll take one step back. We only reach this point in the analysis once we've established what we think is the appropriate stabilized year 1 net operating income of the property. And I think we've done that through our analysis here. And once you've established that, the exercise is to say, what does the market expect as a rate of return on this income? So what are the factors that are going to influence that conclusion? One is the perceived risk, okay? So if I'm saying that we think everything is going to level out and 20% vacancy is fine, regardless of it being actually 65%, and regardless of the market being 24% and increasing with Wallabisa's presence, what does that do to my perception of risk? It increases my risk. So this is the very first factor here. One would expect that my concern about the sustainability of that income is heightened. That increases a capitalization rate. The second is investor expectations for appreciation. Do I think I'm going to do that much better on the NOI? It's kind of tied to the first point. And again, if we're being optimistic in our stabilized NOI like we are, then I don't think there's a great expectation for appreciation necessarily. And the third one is, and this is very important in the market as of April 23, is the required returns in other investment vehicles. So what this is basically saying is that a cap rate for a real estate property is always going to be higher than a risk-free investment, right? It's not as liquid as a GIC. It's prone to market forces more than a GIC. So if a GIC is basically risk-free, and you have a choice between investing in an office building or buying a GIC, you're probably going to take the GIC unless the factors make you believe that the appreciation or the chance to escalate your income is greater with the office. So a cap rate is always going to be higher than a GIC because of the factors that increase it. So what that means is, if a GIC is quite low, the cap rate on a property will likely be low. It's not the only factor. You know, the cost of money is not the only factor, but it certainly influences it. If I'm only going to get 2% from the RBC on a GIC, and I think I can get, I will likely only expect maybe 5 or 6% with that spread between risk-free and real estate investment on the office tower. But if RBC now grants 4%, I'm probably going to require an 8% rate of return because my spread doesn't change, but the cost of money has increased. The point is, the cost of money has a very important factor in the influence of the capitalization rate. On page 6, I'll read a quote from our appraisal text. The bank has the power to regulate general interest rate levels, which strongly influence the discount rates and overall capitalization rates used in real estate. So what has happened between even April 21, which is the last assessment cycle, at the municipal board, we were talking about April 2018. But April 21 and April 23, well, one of the most important things that happened is the cost of money increased, the overnight bank rate increased 425 basis points. You see that on page 7. It shot up and it kept going. By April 23, we were just on the ride up and it didn't even yet hit the top. But at that point, we had gone up 425 basis points. So everything I mentioned, one would expect then that the cost of borrowing would go up, mortgage rates go up, and eventually cap rates would go up. And that's what we saw in that same period. On page 7, we saw the 10-year commercial mortgage rates also increase between 200 to 300 basis points. On page 8, when we look at all cap rates of all properties across Canada, we started to see cap rates increase from 21 to 22. They went up by about 25 to 30 basis points. There's always a lag with cap rates. But as cost of money moves, unless other factors aren't countering that, then cap rates will likely move as well. And as stated in the Q1 23 Collier's cap rate report, they stated clearly cap rates in Winnipeg have begun to increase due to the rising rate environment, which is consistent with other locations in Canada. On page 9, we look specifically to office. All classes of office were flat from 2019, 20, 21, 22, and then start escalating. And here we see an escalation of about 100 basis points by their estimation. So I'll pause a moment, because I'm making it sound like this is the only factor that will influence cap rates, and it's not. I mentioned at the beginning, there are a myriad factors that influence it. And if the expectation for appreciation, or kind of the rosy outlook of the market, is buffering or countering this increase in borrowing costs, then cap rates won't move. We saw that with industrial. We almost saw it with multi-residential. We certainly don't see it with office. And it's because of those other factors. I mentioned the hybrid work. I'm going to read a quote from January 2023 in a Collier's article. The negative effect of hybrid work model on office demand still persists 3 years after the pandemic commenced. The article states, the average square foot space per employee has declined 10% since the onset of the pandemic. And it further states, hybrid work as an isolated factor is predicted to generate a further 4.5% office vacancy. That's at the reference date. They're saying it's going to get even worse. So when you put all the factors together, we have a concerning environment for downtown office from a capitalization standpoint. Now we look at actual cap rates in the market. And this is tough because there wasn't a lot of activity. We're coming out of a pandemic. The market is not strong. It's very soft. There isn't a lot of activity. As an appraiser, we know not to look to the past when the environment is drastically different. That's why we basically try not to look before 2019 unless it's a very specific type of property. So we're looking at things since 2019 for a 5-year scope. We look first to the brokers. Mr. Pohl had that in evidence, and they were saying for Class B that typically it's from 7% to 8.5%. Colliers was the outlier, but they have a correction in my report that they issued to everyone, saying that their conclusions at Q1 23 or Q4 22 were wrong. We see the escalation from the broker reports clearly at the bottom of page 11, where office is the light blue line. That's the one shooting up the most. And then we look to our own analysis of some sales in the market on page 12. So the very first comparison, I think, is an excellent one. It's an office tower not far away from the subject property, 155 Carlton, built around the same time. Strong covenant, very strong provincial covenant, strong occupancy, historically 99%, and I think at the time of sale it was creeping up just under 90%. Connected to the continuous walkway, it's connected both through 185 all the way to Port Germain and True North, and it's connected the other way to the convention center. Sizable underground parkade beneath. In all aspects, I would call this a superior property to the subject. This property sold in September 22, very close to the reference date. And it sold for 25.5 million. And that was a considerable decrease from the original list price. I've interviewed both the vendor and the purchaser about the sale. And one of the major factors that caused the increase, or sorry, the drop in price was as it was sitting on the market, this escalation in borrowing rates started. So it was costing the market more and more to make this transaction, and they therefore would pay less. The eventual price of 25.5 million, when we analyze the actual income, but from a fee simple perspective. So we've looked at this property in the exact same way we look at the subject property, which is we examine the actual rents, but we test to market if we think that the leases are coming up in a certain amount of time. We look at the actual vacancy. We have used 3% as the non-recovered expenses. So we're consistent in that way as well. We've done everything in a similar fashion that we would to the subject property. And the capitalization rate that we derive is 7.48%. It's very difficult to find good comparisons on cap rates in downtown Winnipeg. And I think this is an excellent one. So 7.48%. Now, when we look to lesser building sales, we have two others that were both considered Bs previously, but if they're Bs, they're B minuses. I would actually, and I have in the past, called them C pluses. One is the sister property to 155 Carlton. It's 185 Carlton. Same vendor, different purchaser. And the purchaser in this case recognized that the vacancy is so high in this property. It's around continually around 30% for 5 years or more. They figured that the highest and best use is actually to convert part of the building, 175 Carlton, to multi-residential use. So it was on the market as an office. He purchased it as an office. His intent after is to convert it to multi-res. And if we work out the cap rate on that, and again, we're recognizing all the site-specific factors. So we're applying 25% as the vacancy allowance in our analysis of this building, the maximum vacancy allowance, and all other rates consistent with our typical analysis. And we come up with a cap rate of 8.7%. Very similar situation on Main Street. Again, same age building, mid to late 1970s, 14-story tower. I would call this inferior to the subject in that it is not connected to the walkways. Although it is close to Portage and Main, it's not connected to the walkways. And it was a similar situation to the last property where the vacancy was high and the same purchaser, client of ours, that purchased 185 Carlton, previously had seen this building and they said, you know what, I could do better if I converted this partially to multi-residential. So it was listed on the market as office. He purchased it as office. He made the decision after to convert part of it to multi-res. His capitalization rate based on our analysis was 8.18% for that 2019 transaction. And the last three are suburban, so I won't talk about those here. But what we've done, Mr. Chairman, is we've tried our best to look at the market in a consistent way to our methodologies, to the correct methodologies. And we test that to what the brokers are saying. So recall, they said there's a window there between 7% to 8.5%. And we're showing that it's somewhere between 7.5 and higher for inferior properties. I feel that there's very compelling evidence here, just on the evidence within our cap rate report, to suggest that Class B offices should be between 7.25 to 7.75%. Subject properties at 7.5 is what we concluded. But that's not even considering, back to that point about the feeling in your stomach, about the risk. You know, how do you feel about that stabilized year one income, and where is it going from here? I would feel very uneasy. So I would be very confident in if I were to suggest that it should be higher than 7.5% of the cap rate. But for the purposes of this analysis, we're applying 7.5%. In appendix are the supporting documentations of the listings, the eventual sale price for some of the properties, the appraisal texts on influence of inflation and interest rates on the capitalization rate, the correction by Colliers on the cap rate study, and the other broker studies. I'll just leave it at that, Mr. Chairman, and that concludes our capitalization rate portion. Now I'll just conclude by going back to our main brief. Page 21. On page 21 is our final value. Mr. Pohl had mentioned that we have no contention with the parking income. We've examined that and we feel that is appropriate, especially considering the vacancy. We don't have a contention with the capitalization rate of 7% on the parkade. So where you see blue on page 21 is where there's a variance between the city and Altus. And actually the market rent, we're higher in that case. So really the main factors are the vacancy allowance is the main point, a small amount of difference on the shortfall rate, and then a 50 basis point difference on the capitalization rate. Those are the three areas of contention. And the final value that we conclude is $38,516,000. I don't think there's anything else I need to refer to in the appendix. Many of it is the same as Mr. Pohl. So that will conclude our presentation. Thank you very much.
All right. Before we get into questions, let's take a 5-minute break until 10:25. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Pohl, it's your turn for questions.
Just a couple quick questions. From my review of your work, review of your mind, really this comes down to two issues, cap rate and vacancy.
Yeah.
Let's go to the cap rate first. Would you agree on your page 14 that this is a very low quality 4 feet, given the fact that it had to be converted partially to multifamily, and it was historically under a net rents and
Mr. Pohl, is this on his cap rate study?
yes, this is
Okay.
page 14.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And subsequently, they had to switch it to gross. So operating on a gross basis, and the gross, hopefully, I would think, net has more security for the owner, gross has more security for the tenant. With the retail on the main floor, this property was problematic, so do you feel that this is a good comparison to an executive class OFB?
No, not necessarily. I mean, when it comes to cap rate analysis, it's very difficult ever to find great comparisons. It's a, you know, we don't have a lot to deal with in the secondary market like Winnipeg. So just to reiterate the points I made about the 3 downtown office towers. First one, 155 Carlton, is superior in my opinion to the subject. Number 2, I described this in my opinion as a C plus. I said right at the outset, this is inferior to the subject property. But I want the board to understand that we are fair in how we analyze the property. We apply the higher vacancy allowance, et cetera, et cetera. And the third one as well, I agree, is a, you know, I came to the board on this one calling it a C, if you recall.
Yeah. So leading into I'll get into the next one on page 59, 433 Main. These are conversions for a different purpose. Obviously, a large scale conversion at 433 Main to multifamily.
The first one was a conversion of about 1/3 of the building to multi-res. The second one is about 75%. But here's the main point I'd like to make. They were on the market as office buildings. It was the purchaser's decision, very astute gentleman, that made the decision to convert the buildings after. They weren't marketed.
They were on the market as ill performing office buildings.
Yeah.
So necessary, requiring capital investment to convert over. The subject property is not that. We're not considering turning it over to a multifamily.
Well, it's a very ill-performing property, so I wouldn't say it's out of the question.
Even though with one anchor tenant leaving, it all of a sudden changes to an ill-performing property.
Yes, I would say it's
The only significant issue here is that we had one tenant leave.
126,000 square foot tenant. That was basically carrying the building while they were occupied.
So getting back to your last comparable, you said, or first comparable on page 13, you said this was superior to the property.
Yes.
I never consider this being prime or.
No, I wouldn't either.
So I've always heard this argued at board by yourself or whoever's on Altus that this is an average B.
Average, yes,
So you consider the subject property less than an average B then?
that's correct.
How much parking does this property have on site?
Ample, it has 2 levels of underground parking.
Under ownership
No,
or available to?
it was all developed by Lakeview at the time, so it's 4
But
years.
it's not currently the ownership. If you bought this, it doesn't go with, the parking does not go with the purchase of the property.
I don't know, I don't think so.
Okay, so given the fact that the subject property has ample parking. And similar to this, it does have an extension up to the Bay Arcade, which is still in operation. So you do have off-site parking available, but not under the care and control of the subject property, which would have been true before St. Mary's. Do you feel that a downward adjustment for parking is warranted from the sale price here? So it's at 7.5 approximately, given that it has no parking. The subject property does, but not the subject property then have a warranted downward adjustment on cap, I say 25 basis points, 50 basis points.
Not at all, because the parkade has been valued with the subject property. We already established the value of the parkade. The utility of the parkade.
I'm talking about the subject property selling, you're not, sorry.
Yeah.
You're comparable on page 13, 7.5 cap. If you're using that cap as a comparison to the subject property, would not have warranted downward reflection in cap adjustment made because it doesn't have and it didn't come with the sale of parking?
No, not at all, because I'm using the cap rate on the tower. The parkade is separately assessed. So I'm comparing apples to apples of the tower to the tower. As far as utility to parking, let me finish, Mr. Pohl. The comparison, 155 Carlton has access to underground parking directly from their elevator down, which to me is superior than the majority of exposed parking at the subject property. So again, I disagree. I think it's superior.
I mean, further along this, historically, when I've been reviewing these properties like this at PO with all this, if there is not care and control and there is not parking on the roll number, historically you ask for an increase in cap because there's more risk. Here, the sale of this property at 155 Carlton did not come with a parkade.
I think I don't recall ever asking for a premium cap rate for that. I think we brought up if the property didn't have access to parking, like easy access, you have to cross the street or something. But again, no, the cap rate that I'm contemplating here is on the tower itself. Parkade is separately valued. So I disagree that we should adjust even the tower cap rate in comparison to the 155 Carlton.
Would it not be economically and financially beneficial to have care and control of a parking structure, access to parking under control, whether it be ownership of a parking lot in conjunction with the building? Would that not be preferable to a financial buyer for investor?
I can't really
Mitigating
answer that
risk,
because again,
mitigating risk.
we're trying to blend in the existence of a separately assessed parkade. I mean, the fact of the matter is the parkade at 444 St. Mary, the subject property, is not ideal. It's mostly exposed above ground. Its post-tension construction is causing significant capital concerns for the owner. So I'm not sure if I would agree with any of your statements.
Vacancy. You can turn to my site if you want, you can take your look, or you can go on your information. It was beating the market for a number of years. It was beating the market for a number of years.
Subject property?
Below market.
Oh, well, yes, again, Canada Life had occupied 126,000 feet, it was increasing a bit through this period, from 2008 to 2018, and then they extended for 5 years while they renovated their head office. So the vacancy, of course, was very low through that late teens. The concern was it was starting to increase regardless of Canada Life being there.
So let's speak to the physical building, let's speak to the desirability of the market to the building. The same scenario played out earlier. When Central Gas left, they had a big hole in their building. A relatively short time, it was filled with then Great West Life, now Canada Life. Does that not answer your test that this building can attract and absorb marketplace?
No, because it was a very different marketplace in 2008. So if I was to come to that conclusion, I'd have to look around the marketplace in Winnipeg and say, where are all the large tenancies who are likely to take 100,000 square feet or so in my building? And there are none. Because the fact is, in 2008, we had a healthy market. We had what's called a buyer's market. And in 2023, we have a tenant's market. We have a very soft market. So it's a completely different comparison. But if it had not been for Canada Life occupying that space after Central Gas left, we would have had an extended period of vacancy like what I'm describing here.
Page 18 of your brief. 75 Scarfield, recent photo, I reviewed it. Is this a downtown B?
No. I don't think that's relevant, though. I think it's what the board is trying to do is consider how we look at site-specific vacancy.
Would you not consider the subject property being one of the largest? I think Great West Life is about the same size, but generally one of the largest downtown OFBs wouldn't have the same financial risk and purchaser as the 75 Scarfield.
I don't think size has anything to do with it. I mean,
Completely different property.
well, yeah,
Completely different
again,
market.
Mr. Poole, the point of that order is not to compare the values of properties. It's looking at what the board's direction is when we are faced with a site-specific vacancy greater than significantly greater than market. What do we do when we value the property? That's the point.
I've reviewed this property in full, including the order and the permits that was an error that were made. Did you happen to look at the vacancy of this property after the order came out? Meaning, once the order was done, there's a reference date past that.
Yeah.
Is there a significantly long-term vacancy in there currently?
So if you're asking me to consider what happened to the property after the deliberation.
We're not limited anymore. We can review the order and see what actually happened to the vacancy on the property.
Yeah.
Vacancy otherwise.
I can't actually, I think so, but I mean, I think that's an irrelevant point, Mr. Cole, because number one, that's not what's being deliberated by the board. That wouldn't have been in evidence. And number two, this is the whole point of having assessment cycles, is that when we have elevated vacancies for a sustained period of 3 years in this case, it's recognized in the valuation. If it corrects itself later, it's recognized in the valuation.
Given that the rest of argument is relatively similar. I don't have any questions. Okay, thanks.
Okay, that concludes your questions, Mr. Poe.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, Ms. Anderson, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Knight?
Sorry, you just made a comment about sustained vacancy for 3 years on this property. So I'm trying to find that vacancy in your presentation. What page is the vacancy on?
The vacancy is summarized on page 17, and sorry, Ms. Knight, I should have used the word stabilized, not sustained. So the
Okay.
stabilized vacancy is what the board was looking at in the 75 Squarefield decision, 3 years
Yeah.
stable. And the 3 years stabilized, you can see on page 17 is 31%.
Okay. Okay, that's just what I wanted to figure out. Oh, I'm good, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I just have more of a comment, and it's more, I guess, my own personal preference. But if you're going to refer to municipal board decisions, I prefer to see the entire decision
Okay.
because it can frequently be distinguished based on their facts, or
Yeah,
at
very
least
good
so that's important. Other than that, I have no questions. So summation, Mr.
I have
Poe.
rebuttal.
Oh, you have rebuttal? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, this was second yesterday. I don't know
Okay.
if the comment had a chance to.
No.
But thanks.
Do we have that?
I'm moving it right now.
Okay,
Let me know when I can proceed.
All right. As soon as I see it. Um,
Okay, it should be there if you refresh it up.
that the yesterday at 2:42. Rebuttal, yes. Okay. Does everyone have it?
yeah,
This is a board order that I was associated with. I was the assessor on 330 St. Mary's for the 2016 appeal year. It was, as part of it, had a issue with vacancy, whether it was basically the same argument you hear today. And the board made a recent order on it. So page 1 of the order indicates I'm the assessor assigned to it. The Colliers, 330 St. Mary's is an executive deed as well, B prime. Very similar to the subject property. If you look at my page 10, vacancy obviously was different. Vacancy at 9% was applied, calculated from vacancy rates on 2013 ID questionnaires of 10 comparable properties, and augmented by market vacancy rate information. Although, and this is highlighted for convenience, although the property had a higher vacancy rate at the reference date due to expiry lease of a significant tenant, building had experienced much lower vacancy rates previously. And the assessor expects that the vacancy rate to normalize as we go forward. It's the exact same argument here, exact same kind of building, a significant building, 330 St. Mary's, 444 St. Mary's is the same. The argument from the owner was it was approximately 25% vacant, like 24.7% vacant. And as we see from the order on page 20, the agent calculates the vacancy rate of 11.78% by the year end of 2012, and April 1st, 2014. It went up to 25% and then kind of dropped. So one moment in time was 25%. The methodology overemphasizes the vacancy rate at a single point in time rather than estimating a stabilized vacancy rate for the property of this quality. The board with reference date vacancy rates, including the agent brief, were not considered. At that point, we could try and use post reference information indicating that vacancies is occurring. The board considers that the assessor's vacancies and the board considers the assessor's analysis to be more reflective than 8.5 to 9%. And you can see that on page 22. So basically, we have the same kind of scenario here. Granted, here's 65%. And there was about 25%. 7%. So we had two moments of time. The board looked at the property, what it was, and made a determination that no, it should be at market. Here we are at 12%. This property was healthy. It did have under market vacancy. What we see here is the exact same scenario playing out. So I don't feel that putting a increase from what our market was at 12% is warranted at this point in time. But again, that's up to the board to make its decision.
Okay, questions, Mr. Slaughter, on this
Yeah.
rebuttal?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Pohl, let's just make sure that we're talking about similar circumstances here. The reference date for this order is April 2014, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the vacancy rate that the owner was asking, they took an average of 3 years, but not really. They kind of fudged the third year and they took a specific moment in time. And they concluded just under 12% is what the number was. And your position was 9%.
Correct.
So that delta is significantly different than the delta we're talking about now.
As I've explained, there was a point in time where a large tenant left and it left was 25% vacant, approximately. Here, we have a large tenant leaving at 65%, bigger scale, obviously.
Much
bigger
scale.
But the rationale is the same.
Yeah.
You have an anchor tenant leave, it's gonna leave a hole in your building. In your income stream, so to speak. It wasn't warranted to make a reduction then, the same rationale should be applied here.
Okay, so I think it's key that we recognize that these are very, very different numbers that we're talking about. So in a multi-tenanted building, one tenant left at one point at April 14. And that caused the 3-year vacancy to be 12%. Now, the market vacancy at that time, I mean, in your study, I think it states here that Johnson was saying about 9%. So the actual market vacancy was 9. So there was a blip of one tenant, a small, like larger in relation to the other tenants, but only about 2 floors of space. And they left for a very short period, causing a difference of only 3% of the vacancy. We have the majority tenant leaving, causing 65% vacancy. We also have the difference of what the board has said here is the variance isn't that great. We'll go back to the market of 9. Well, the market in our case is 24%. So the facts are completely different. Would you agree?
The scenario is exactly the same. An anchor tenant left, it created a hole in your income stream. This scenario is exactly the same. They left in 2022, I believe. They were advertising it anyways at that. So the scenario is the same. You just have a bigger anchor tenant leaving.
Okay, so even
The rationale, for equity's sake, should be applied the same way.
Even if I was to agree with you that it doesn't matter the size of the vacancy or the longevity of the vacancy, it doesn't matter any of that. A tenant leaves and we ignore it and we go to market. Even if that was the conclusion, which is against every other decision I've seen from the municipal board. But then would we not look at your market vacancies of 22 to 24%? Because the board looked at the market vacancy of 9% in this case.
I have looked at that. As you can see, it's in the study. We have a moment of time where we have a higher degree of vacancy. The board will have to make its decision on that. I'm just pointing out, if you have an anchor tenant, it would be no more different than if we came in, I'd appeal a few years back and I went, it's 9 or 12 or whatever the vacancy was, but we see a 1.8% vacancy or 2% vacancy. I'd like to change it to 4%. You would not, and the owner would not appreciate that. This is the exact same scenario here that we're looking at, just on the opposite end of it. You've got a vacancy that occurred within the property. It was literally the last year, several years being below market. Why would we make an adjustment for it on a chronicle forward basis when we haven't seen that play out yet? We've seen the exact opposite. We've seen this building go, a large tenant leave, Central Gas, and then fill up relatively quick. We're seeing the exact same thing play out now. So.
Okay, so my last question then on this is, you're saying basically that the two conflicting board decisions are, one says look to actual and consider that. The other one here is saying the actual's, a little bit higher, but we're going to go to market. So if we look at those two scenarios, we have actual with the subject property being 65%. We have the market at 24%. Where does 12 come from?
The 12% was the overall. If we look at the median, it's 14.4%.
No, it's 18%.
No, for the stabilized.
Well, the median, what's your average? I mean, you can pick any number you
No,
like,
no,
but.
you do all three to give a good metric, and vacancy, to be clear, vacancy is not the same as rent. Where rent, you have a average, you're gonna have a few dollars less, few dollars more, it's gonna be a more normalized distribution pattern. Vacancy is either 0 or 100%. Over a populace of 17 properties or so, you're gonna have a wider range, and anywhere between those numbers, so, I don't feel that this building, given its performance and its ability to recover from vacancy, had we seen prior, it being the marketplace. It's still asking for rents that aren't dropping in rate like you see at 215 Gary, because they were asking at 17% for a B and now they're down to 13, or sorry, $17 and down to $13 for asking rate. You don't see that here. You see it still being advertised as executive, you still see advertising between 16 and 18. They're holding steady. You're gonna have to wait till it fills up, and we really can't even have that test because it just went vacant. From an economic standpoint, it just went vacant. Everything that we see here on this property is that it's better than average, and you're indicating because one tenant leaves, it's not somehow less than average.
No questions, no further questions.
Okay, Ms. Anderson, any questions on the rebuttal?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Knight?
No, sir.
Okay, now on to summation, Mr. Pohl, if you wish.
Quick summation, I feel that the recommended value 48,552,000 is reasonable with the adjustment that I indicated from the 3% non-recoverable to 5% ratio for that. I feel this property was reviewed heavily, and we're both in agreement on this at the municipal board. It was probably the largest appeal. It was the largest appeal I've ever been involved with as far as argument presented. I think all of us will agree on their behalf. It was as well. From that, we had a sale in the property approaching in 2016, 80% interest at 37.3 million. 100% interest extrapolated 100% would have been 44.7. We had a municipal court order that gave a $47.3 million value. We now have a couple of years later, we have a value of 48 million, 550,000. I think we're in line with what this board was indicating, albeit market has changed as far as the vacancy has been increasing. What we see is that better properties perform better in the marketplace. You see that for the Class A properties for AA, you see any property that is a executive higher, better building performs better than below average buildings. This is one of those properties. We see that in past, a large tenant like Central Gas, this building filled up relatively quick and went to under market vacancy for a number of years and had a very strong performance in the marketplace. We now have the same scenario playing out again where Great West Life, or then Great West Life, now Canada Life, left. It will take some time to lease up, but it will perform better in the marketplace. And that's the rationale for not having a knee-jerk reaction for vacancy that over time hasn't shown that it's to be chronic. And it's not chronic. You had one tenant leave. That's what happens when you have an anchor tenant occupy more than half your building. So there's been no physical characteristics change to the building. There's been no anything that was different in the municipal board order from now. We still have some parking issues in the Park 8, which I highlighted on, and that's most likely playing into the higher non-recoverable expenses. But what I feel here is the rationale from the municipal board order, what the marketplace was applied, and how we're looking at the performance of the property. This is one of the best of what these in the marketplace. So with that, I don't think there's any, at this moment in time, warranted adjustment from 12% vacancy. If this building over the next 4 or 5 years hovered around 40%, greater than around there, and we've seen that it just couldn't get back to more market vacancy rate, then we would be looking to make an adjustment. We would be looking to make temporary adjustments for vacancy. That hasn't occurred yet. It literally just went on the marketplace. So to give a greater than market vacancy, I don't think it's appropriate. And I think the capitalization rate that we applied was appropriate. not persuaded by the agent's comparables. So I think with that, I think our value that I'm recommending today, adjusted value at 48,552,000 is warranted. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the assessor's summation basically proved the point that there's nothing in evidence which supports his position. It's all opinion. A significant vacancy like this cannot be ignored in the marketplace. They knew that Great West Life would be leaving at August 22. If they were able to secure a tenant in that time, they would have. It's sitting vacant as of April 23. It's going to sit vacant into the future. There's nobody in the market that I think could fill that amount of space. But let's put that argument aside. Let's put on the rosy hat and say this will bounce back to market no time flat. The assessor keeps dodging around the fact that the property itself was 15% vacant before Canada Life left. 15. The market for Class B is in the high teens to low 20s, depending if you listen to the assessor or the brokers. There's nothing in evidence to suggest anything less than the high teens or 20%. And that would be if we ignore the significant vacancy in the property. So I think the evidence is clear on that matter. I also think the evidence is quite strong on the capitalization rates. It's corroborated by what the brokers are saying. I think the comparison of 155 Carlton is a great comparison. And certainly if we're to be as optimistic as to say, let's ignore the realities of what's happening with this property. By the way, the property can't possibly be prime. It's located on the periphery of downtown. It's essentially isolated. It has less improvements done to the property than other Bs. But let's ignore all that and say that it's going to perform better. Well, any investor would think that's a very risky proposition, and the cap rate would only go up. So I feel very confident in our conclusions, and I thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So we've now heard all the items on today's agenda, so this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about, gentlemen.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.